So did Marcion compile the first New Testament? A few things first. The Gospel of Mark, as I mentioned earlier, was the first. This is the first gospel. Matthew and Luke are, by many scholars, seem to be nearly mirrors of one another. And then John is much later. Matthew and Luke are extremely similar. And in many places, I think it's actually like up to 85 or 90% are the same. There are just little things that are different. What this means, all of that, Mark being first, then Matthew and Luke, then John. What this means is that Mark is different from Matthew, Luke, and John. John is different from Matthew, Luke, and Mark, but Luke and Matthew are identical in many ways, literally, and then are similar in other ways, in the ways that they are not identical. The way that scholars have always made sense of Matthew and Luke being almost identical in many ways is by creating within scholarship this theoretical gospel that is referred to as Q. So if you ever listen to scholars or you read something and you see that they're referring to something called Q, it's the Q gospel. That's what they're referring to. And so when I use Q moving forward, that's what I'm talking about. Q is derived from the word quella, which literally just means source. So what they're saying is that Matthew and Luke had a source that they were writing off of. They were copying. They were doing what scribes do and pulling, but they were intentionally adding. And it's not to say it was malicious. It's just to say that they were both using the same source and then putting their own personality into the text. So Matthew putting more Matthew into it, but it wasn't actually written by Matthew, and Luke putting more Luke into it. I hope that makes sense, and if it doesn't, let me know. I can back up and try to say it in a different way. But Q is an unknown source. We don't have it. It's theoretical, just based on reconstructions that scholars do because of Matthew and Luke, but also others that we'll talk about. This Q gospel that we don't have seems to be the primary source for a number of texts that they're pulling from this Q gospel, this quella, this unknown source. The theory, widely accepted by New Testament scholars, is that there was a gospel source that is not surviving today, that the early authors used as a source. It is assumed that the author of Matthew and Luke both used Q to write their gospel. And this is why so much of one mirrors the other. The idea is that Mark and Q were the earliest two sources. However, with Mark being the only surviving one, and Q being theoretical because we don't have it, but scholars believe it existed. Meaning later gospels likely used definitely Q, but seemingly Mark in other places too, as a reference, as a source to write their gospel. So what about Marcion? Matthias Klinghardt is a scholar. He discovered that if we take Marcion's gospel and compare it with the four canonical gospels, we can see that the need for Q, this theoretical gospel, becomes obsolete. It's irrelevant, making the hypothesis that Marcion is Q, because Marcion fills the gaps. The Q gospel switched with Marcion, everything makes sense. This, like everything else, is not entirely agreed upon, though, as it would pose other problems for the canon. So I'll say this in a different way. This theoretical gospel that was being used as a reference or a source for Matthew and Luke for sure, but likely John in some places too, and in other texts that we'll talk about in a minute, like the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Thomas, several of these other early Christian texts use Q that we don't have as their source. Marcion scholars, people who are in that world, have done the work required to try to see if Marcion fits Q. And it seems, although not agreed upon, it seems as though Marcion does fit Q, which would make sense if Marcion wrote the first New Testament. It would make sense that Marcion had gathered, found, heard of the stories that were being passed around, both orally and whatever documents were being passed around at the time, compiled a gospel, because he had one gospel, Paul's 10 letters. That became the New Testament. Later gospel writers used that text as a source, We know that we don't have a surviving Gospel of Marcion because everybody hated Marcion, just like the Gnostics, and everything got burned and destroyed, which is why we don't have it. It just so happens that we've always been talking about Q, this gospel that we don't have, and he fits the bill. So it's very likely, this is my opinion now, because I'm on this side. Bias. I believe it makes perfect sense that Marcion is Q. Because just logically, Occam's razor, for Marcion to not be Q, you have to do a lot of work to be like, no, there's no way. You have to do very little work to say, yes, that makes sense. And it's a lot. And I know. The biggest reason, in my opinion, that scholars who don't agree with that, the reason they don't want to agree with that is because if we do that, it poses problems for other canonical texts. Consistency issues, which the Bible is already full of. The New Testament is full of consistency issues. But if Q is Marcion, it causes more issues. Because then even more doesn't quite fit right. More things suddenly become clear as being, why is that there? Where did that come from? It opens a lot of doors. Mikkel said, now hearing it from you, Joe, it clicks, makes sense to me. Mark's gospel coming first, then Marcion being the original author of the Gospel of Luke, then Matthew's gospel taking from Marcion's and Mark. Right. It's really interesting because when I first went through all of this, my brain exploded. And then I went through all of it again, years ago. I went through all of it again, and I'm like, oh, this all makes perfect sense. Everything that has bothered me, my entire life in Christianity, and like specifically on this side of things, it all just is like, oh, got it. I wish somebody would have just told me this a long time ago. This all makes perfect sense. My brain's currently exploding. I'm sorry, but hopefully this will make it better. And if it doesn't make it better, it will make it much worse. We'll see. Oh, so Ghost said, so is Q or Marcion paraphrasing Mark? How do those particular words end up on the page? In part, but like it's not, I wouldn't say that Marcion's gospel, which we don't have, is a reconstruction of Mark. It seems to have taken from whatever was floating around. So if you look at it like this, if we have a really hard time today thinking of the New Testament and thinking of the Bible as not being like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and then Paul's epistles, and then a few other texts. We have a really hard time with that. It takes, and maybe it's just me, but I have a really hard time with that. When you blank all of that information out, you know nothing. There's no Bible. It does not exist. We have an Old Testament. The only thing that is out there is oral tradition. So you have these Gnostics, you have these proto-Orthodox, you probably have a few other kind of sects of Christianity, but nothing prominent, who are all telling stories and having church services. And during all of that, most of these people can't read or write. So Jesus's followers were not writing anything. They couldn't write. Most of them could not read. Plus, this is much later. We're talking 40 to 70 beyond years later. We know that based on these texts, we know that some things were being passed around on paper, but that was it. So the like common assumption is that Marcion, because of where he was and who he was kind of clicked in with, had compiled from someone somewhere, maybe aggregated from a number of different sources, what then became his gospel. So what it was, if you picture it, is like, and some of it was probably oral, but Marcion's sitting at a desk in his room, and he gets dropped off like, 3 pieces of paper that tell some stories about Jesus. Somebody else brings another piece of paper. It's got a miracle of Jesus. Somebody else brings something else. It's the Sermon on the Mount. And he has this data that he then puts together and is like, this is the gospel of Jesus Christ. It has who Jesus was. It has the miracles he performed. It is a comprehensive, as much as it could be, who is Jesus Christ? This is the new Torah. That's how I picture it, is he just had these things kind of file in. He also heard some stories, so he wrote them down. I'm not saying that's what happened, but that seems to be like the easiest way to conceptualize it. And so then he creates the gospel of Jesus Christ. And then he's, for whatever reason or however, he got the epistles of Paul, and he's like, these should go in here too. So he's got the gospel, and he's got the 10 letters of Paul rejecting the pastoral epistles. I hope that clip was informational. If it wasn't, I hope it was at least kind of amusing or entertaining in some fashion. Either way, if you want to watch the full live stream, you can click right here. We do a number of these live streams every week on 2 different YouTube channels, at Tattooed Theist and at Live Bible Study. If you click the link to our Discord server in the description below, there's an events page there that shows you where and when all the live streams are. You'll also then be a part, whether you like it or not, of our dysfunctionally beautiful Discord family.